In this chapter, one of the analyses that you're going to do is picking out the noun phrases out of a passage. This presentation is about how you identify them. To identify a noun phrase, there are really 3 steps. First, you can go through the passage and find every noun, because every noun phrase is, of course, going to have a noun as its head. It's not true that every noun is going to be the head of a noun phrase. But if you identify every noun, then you can go to the second step, which is decide if each one is the head of a phrase. Then once you find the phrase, you find the boundaries. Where does it start and where does it end? You go through all those 3 steps, and then you have all the noun phrases. So the first question is, how do you find a noun? Now, remember, I know you remember that we keep emphasizing that the properties of a noun class that are most interesting and most useful in the syntactic analysis are not the semantic ones. They're not about meaning. The 2 kinds of properties that are going to be really useful for picking out nouns are the morphological ones and the syntactic ones. So let's look at the 2 morphological properties that will help you find one. First of all, you know what kind of suffix a prototypical noun takes. That is a plural suffix. So for example, we can take a prototypical noun like sandwich, and we will see that it adds a plural suffix and becomes sandwiches. That is a sign of a noun. Other kinds of words do not become plural. Now, not every noun becomes plural either, right? Because there are uncountable ones. Now, it's true that a lot of the ones that we think of as uncountable can actually become plural. That is, we can think of most of our nouns that we think of as uncountable can also be thought of in a countable sense. So take water, right? Normally we think, okay, water is a mass. You don't have 1 water, 2 waters. But sometimes you do. Now that we keep water in bottles a lot, it's perfectly acceptable to say, okay, bring about 4 waters. Or you could go in a store and order 4 coffees, right? So, but nevertheless, there are some nouns that are uncountable that it's pretty hard to think of them taking a plural suffix. For example, if you're talking to one person who has been very honest, you can say, your honesty impresses me. If there are 2 people there, you're probably not going to say, your honesties impress me. It's pretty hard to make honesty plural, right? Nevertheless, it's a noun. And there is another property. You will see other properties that can help you pick out the nouns that aren't prototypical, even if the plural suffix test fails. The other morphological characteristic is that nouns take the genitive suffix. Almost every noun takes the genitive suffix. So if we go back to our example, we can see the example of the sandwich's taste, we could say. Or the sandwich's date, if you're talking about when it expires. You can put the genitive suffix on a lot of uncountable nouns, so that might help you identify them. Other kinds of words don't take the genitive suffix, of course. If you put the genitive suffix on a word, it's a noun. All right, so those are your 2 morphological properties to help you decide if something is a noun. Now let's look at the syntactic ones. My very favorite one is this. Syntactic. When you talk about the syntactic characteristics of a noun, what you're talking about, the ones that you're talking about that will be useful for finding the noun itself are the dependents. That is to say, what can modify the noun, what can go inside a phrase where the head is a noun. And the most useful one, my favorite one, is the determinative. Only a noun can take a determinative as a dependent. So what this means in practice is that if you build a phrase, the blank, the is one of the very prototypical determinatives of English, right? If you build a phrase, the blank, and you could put a word in there and make a complete phrase, that word is a noun. So of course it works with sandwich, the sandwich, that's prototypical. It also works with honesty, right? The honesty. Like, what impressed me was the honesty. What impressed me was their honesty. That is a determinative that gets used with honesty a lot. So that's going to work for pretty much every noun. the sincerity, as in Clark took a drink and gauged the sincerity of the thinly veiled threat. That's a long noun phrase, the sincerity of the thinly veiled threat. Even a proper noun can take a determinative. Now, they don't usually, right? We usually say Japan. We don't usually say the Japan. But we can. It can happen like this. Recently, the Japan that traditionally said no to U.S. trade demands has begun to say yes. That sentence sounds perfectly unmarked to you, it's perfectly natural to you in context, right? You can even do it with people's names. We don't usually say the Kathy. But suppose you talk about Kathy, and you know a couple Kathys, and the person you're talking to misunderstands which one you meant. You could say, no, not the Kathy at work, the Kathy in my class. You can do that. Here's an example from the corpus. She didn't look like Kathy. Now, that's how we usually use a proper noun. But look at this. The Kathy that I knew, the Kathy that I met, the Kathy that I married. It's perfectly possible to put a determinative on a proper noun. So the determinative test is a really good one for a noun. If you put the and then put a word that comes after it and makes a complete phrase, it doesn't work with an adjective, right? Like the regular, then you're still waiting for the end. Regular is not a noun, but the people. People is a noun. All right, a couple other syntactic tests, which is to say a couple other kinds of dependents that can go inside the noun phrase. Adjective phrases can modify nouns. You already know this, right? So the sandwich is the head noun. The perfect sandwich, perfect is an adjective. It's an adjective phrase. It could be the very perfect sandwich, right? Doesn't matter if perfect has its own modifiers. What matters is that we know that sandwich is a noun, among other reasons, because it's being modified by an adjective. Perfect is an adjective. And the third kind of dependent that follows nouns, that goes along with nouns and doesn't go with other kinds of words, is the relative clause. You can identify something as a noun if it's modified by a relative clause. We're going to do relative clauses later in the course, so let's not worry about them a lot right now. But here's an example for you. A lot of you already know about relative clauses, and almost all of you will recognize this example, I think. The sandwich that Max made. That Max made. This is a relative clause where Max is a subject, made is the verb, and that is the object. So it's a clause, and it has two nouns inside it. But that whole clause is a modifier of sandwich, so it's inside the big noun phrase. The big noun phrase here is the sandwich that Max made. And inside it is a relative clause, and inside that relative clause are two other noun phrases. So you can have noun phrases inside other noun phrases, as we're going to see. But the key point here is that one more piece of evidence that sandwich is a noun is that it's being modified by a relative clause, that Max made. Okay, now we have all of the criteria. We have two morphological characteristics and three syntactic characteristics to work with. So let's practice a little bit picking out some nouns. Here is the title of an article. What nouns do you see in this title? Pause the video if you need to, and pick out every noun that you see in this title. And when you're ready, go on. Okay, you can pretty much use the determinative test to find the nouns. So, the Dave Barry. This works, right? It's a proper noun, and it sounds better with a relative clause. The Dave Barry that used to write a newspaper column sounds better. But you can definitely use Dave Barry with the determinative. The year sounds perfectly good. The review sounds good. The 2010 is a proper noun, so it sounds better with a relative clause. The 2010 that could have been, that's actually a phrase. You can Google it. That one's not from the corpus. It's just from Google. So the determinative test right away will give you this list of nouns. Dave Barry, year, review, 2010. Now, the one that it won't give you is us. Pronouns are a kind of noun. They stand in the place of the noun, so obviously they're going to have the same syntactic characteristics pretty much, right? Because they plug into the sentence. But the thing is, they plug into the sentence in the place of a whole noun phrase, not a noun by itself. So that's why they don't work with a determiner, because a determiner is part of a noun phrase. And so the pronoun replaces the whole noun phrase, including the determiner. So we don't get the us. We just get us. But every time you see a pronoun, mark it as a noun phrase. Sometimes it will have other things in the phrase with it, like relative clauses. Don't worry about that. All right, here's the whole passage. Okay, no, it's not the whole article, but here is a passage. So pause the video and identify every noun in this passage, including the ones in the title. There are 42 by my count. That's if you count Dave Barry as just one, not two, and Jersey Shore as one, not two. And a couple of them are relative pronouns. If you don't find those, don't worry about that very much right now, because we'll talk about those when we talk about relative clauses. All right, now pause the video and try to identify every noun. When you're ready, go on. Okay, here are all of the nouns that I got. Check to see that you got them all. If you have questions about identifying any of these words as nouns, go to the discussion board and find a good place. Find a place where it's a relevant question and post a question about it. All right. The next thing to consider is which of these nouns are heads of noun phrases and which are the ones that are just dependents inside noun phrases, modifying other nouns. Most of them are heads of noun phrases. Here, to help us do this test, or to help us do this part of the analysis, let's compare these two phrases. Say you have a phrase, the Cretaceous period, as he has in this article, I think, and compare that phrase to the incubation period. Now, in the Cretaceous period, you only see the one noun. Cretaceous is an adjective. It has the one of the adjective morphological endings. It's really clear. So we have a noun phrase where the noun is a head. The head is a noun, of course, and the dependents are one determiner and one adjective. But compare that with the incubation period. Period is, of course, still a noun. But incubation is a noun too, right? If it was an adjective, it would be incubatory. Incubation is a noun. You can say the incubation of the eggs or something like that. But the incubation is not a noun phrase. The incubation period is one big noun phrase. Inside it, it has two nouns. Period is the head, and incubation is modifying the head. Now, if you've already taken a linguistics class, what you'll want to say is that incubation period is a noun phrase, and the incubation period is a bigger noun phrase. That's fine. If you are not at that stage, don't worry about that. What you need to worry about is recognizing that not every noun heads a noun phrase. In this example, period heads a noun phrase. Incubation doesn't. It's a dependent in a noun phrase. Dependent and a head are the two complementary things here. All right, so here is an example where incubation is a noun. Immediately after the incubations, the samples were placed on ice. And that shows incubation taking a determinative as a dependent, and taking a plural suffix, two really good indications that that's a noun. And I think that the reason that I'm pointing this out to you is that some of you are still in your heads, I think, trying to argue that it's an adjective because it modifies a noun. But this is my evidence to you that it is a noun, but it's not the head noun of the phrase. Period is the head noun of the phrase. Now let's take this sentence. The incubation period is from 2 to 7 days. The subject of this sentence is the noun phrase, the incubation period. You see that? That's what the verb agrees with, the incubation period. The head noun period has a determinative dependent, the, and it has a noun dependent, incubation. And the whole noun phrase functions as a subject. All right, now we're going to go on to the third part of the analysis, and this is going to help us understand more what constitutes a noun phrase. The third part is identifying the boundaries of a noun phrase. Where does it start? Where does it end? And we're going to start with this same sentence for an example. Okay, there are tests you do to find the boundaries, and the first one is a great one. It's the substitution test. You substitute a pronoun. A pronoun should replace the whole noun phrase in most cases. It should replace a lexical noun phrase. So if we try it with this sentence, what can we do? We can say, it is from 2 to 7 days. That's grammatical, right? Out of context, it doesn't, you have trouble with the meaning because you don't know what it is, but that's not the issue. Syntactically, it's perfect. It is from 2 to 7 days. Now, what if you were to try to replace incubation with a pronoun? The it period is from 2 to 7 days. Crashingly bad. What if we try to replace period with a pronoun? The incubation it is from 2 to 7 days. Just as bad. Doesn't matter if it's the head noun or a dependent noun. What matters is that you replace the whole noun phrase. A pronoun wants to replace a lexical noun phrase, not just a noun. So, how does that help you? It helps you because if you put the pronoun in there and find out what it replaces and still makes a syntactically good sentence, then the thing that it replaced in the sentence is the noun phrase. Then you found the beginning and the end. That's how pronouns work. So let's try it with the first two sentences in Dave Barry's Year in Review. The sentences say, let's put things into perspective. 2010 was not the worst year ever. There have been much worse years. Substitute a pronoun for each underlined noun here and all the dependents that go with it. And when you do that, your sentence should sound grammatical, whether it makes sense or not. Don't worry about that. All right, and don't use the pronoun one or ones. Those do not work well in this test. The results aren't reliable. Now look at the sentence for a minute and try to substitute other pronouns. All right. Here's how I did it. Let's put them into it. I know into it doesn't make sense very much, but it's perfectly grammatical, right? It was not it. Also a pretty bad sentence stylistically, but there's nothing wrong with the grammar. There have been some. So we can see that things is a noun phrase by itself because we can replace it with a word. Perspective is a noun phrase by itself, and 2010 is a noun phrase by itself. All of those got replaced with a pronoun. All right, but year, we can't say the worst it ever. We have to just say it was not it. The worst year ever is a noun phrase, so the pronoun replaces the whole thing. We can't say there have been much worse some. We could say there have been much worse ones, but that's because that's what I was saying about ones not working well in this test. Don't use one or ones because they give you false results. If we use some, we see there have been some is grammatical. So what is being replaced is much worse years. The whole noun phrase is much worse years. And that works out well. Years is the head of the phrase. Worse is an adjective, of course. It's the comparative form of bad, and much is a determinative. Determinatives and adjectives are dependents in noun phrases. Here are the noun phrases with brackets. This is how you can do your analysis. All right. Now, let's look at some cases that are a little more complicated. In the in the third sentence, we can bracket Earth. Earth was struck by an asteroid. We can just say it was struck by an asteroid, so Earth is a noun phrase by itself. So far, so good. All right. But look at the phrase before that, toward the end of the Cretaceous period. Now, here we can do two things. We can either say toward the end of it. Perfectly good grammatical, right? Grammatically. So that indicates that the Cretaceous period is a noun phrase. Or we can say toward it. And that indicates that the end of the Cretaceous period is a noun phrase. Okay, why are we getting two different answers from our test here? Is the test failing in this regard with this sentence? Sometimes it can because of peculiar characteristics of the sentence. But in this case, actually the results are true. You're getting two different noun phrases because there are two noun phrases here. What you have is one inside the other. The Cretaceous period is a noun phrase, which is the object of the preposition of. You see it? Of the Cretaceous period. That's a preposition with a noun phrase. All right? And the whole thing of the Cretaceous period modifies the noun and. And the determinative of the also modifies the noun and. So what you have is a noun phrase inside a prepositional phrase, which is inside a bigger noun phrase. The pronoun was able to replace either noun phrase. You could do it either way. It's not at all uncommon to get one noun phrase inside another. It's not uncommon at all. You can see it again in the next two clauses. Here you go. Try to find the structure of the noun phrase in these two clauses. Look for, let's see, the relative clause here, that wiped out about 75% of the species on the planet. Try to find noun phrases in there, and then go for the next sentence and look at the noun clause, that we had a worse year than those species did. Try to find noun phrases in there and pause the video until you're ready. Okay, this is my analysis. You could replace the planet with it. So you could say the species on it. So I'm calling that one noun phrase. Or you could replace the species on the planet with them. So it could go wiped out about 75% of them. So I'm calling that a noun phrase too. Right? The planet is inside the species on the planet. This is not at all uncommon. You can see it in parts of the next two sentences, or rather the next few clauses. Look for the structure of the noun phrases in these parts. Look at the part that goes, wiped out about 75% of the species on the planet. See if you can figure out how noun phrases fit inside each other there. And then go to the next sentence and look at the second part, the clause that starts with that we had a worse year than those species did. Try to put noun phrases inside each other in that part. Pause the tape until you're ready. Okay, this is my analysis. You could replace the planet with it, which is to say, you could say the species on it. So I'm calling that a noun phrase, the planet. You could also replace the species on the planet with them. So I'm calling that a noun phrase. You could say 75% of them. So what I have is the planet is inside the species on the planet. And then if you want to look a little bit broader, we can see that both of those noun phrases fit inside the bigger noun phrase, of which the head is asteroid. Do you see that? You have the determinative and, you have the head noun asteroid, and then you have a relative clause. That is the subject of it, and that's a pronoun. Don't worry about that one too much. But 75% of, I'm calling that a determinative, and then the species on the planet. And all of the noun phrases end at the end of the sentence there. Now go to the last one. Again, we have a clause here. This one's not a relative clause, but don't worry. That is not a pronoun here. It's just connecting the dependent clause to the independent one. So we is a subject, that's a noun, of course, and then had is a verb. Okay, now, inside this noun phrase, which is going to be the direct object of had, you have a little one, those species. You can replace that with a pronoun, can't you? You could say a worse year than they did. So I'm going to call those species a noun phrase. And how about a worse year than those species did? You can say, can we honestly say that we had it? Grammatical, even though semantically it's bad, right? So that's a big noun phrase containing a smaller noun phrase. The head of the big one is year. All right, that is the substitution test, and it works pretty well for most noun phrases. There are some that it doesn't work as well for. If you run into trouble with it, you can try a different test, which is the movement test. What you do with a movement test is you move part of the sentence to make a different kind of sentence. And the principle is that when you move things, you have to move whole phrases. Parts of phrases, for example, just ahead of the phrase, won't move. Okay, here's an example. Take this kind of sentence. Can we honestly say that we had a worse year than those species did, is the sentence that Dave Berry used. And I'm going to claim here that this is a more basic structure, and I could make a fancier sentence, so to speak, by doing this. Can we honestly say that a worse year than those species had is what we had? Stylistically, it's bad. Don't focus on that. Grammatically, it's okay. Can we honestly say that a worse year than those species had is what we had? Now, what did I do? I moved a worse year than those species did. And I'm substituting had just to just to semantically make it better. It's not going to change the syntax at all because they're exactly the same form of verb. And I put that, can we honestly say that I put that before the verb is, and then I put in what. This kind of construction is called the pseudo cleft. We're going to deal with them way towards the end of the semester, so don't worry about how you make a pseudo cleft right now. Focus on the fact you can do this instinctively. This is part of your competence as a native speaker or a proficient speaker of English, that you know how to do pseudo clefts even if you don't know what they're called. The principle here is that we moved something, and what we moved had to have been a phrase. So, for example, take this sentence. Can we honestly say that a worse year is what we had than those species did, or than those species had? Neither verb helps that sentence, right? What is wrong with this sentence? What's wrong with this is that I tried to make the pseudo cleft, but I failed to move enough stuff. I moved a worse year, but that's not the whole noun phrase. It contains the head. It even contains some of the modifiers. But I didn't move the whole noun phrase. So the sentence turned out bad. All right, that gives an ungrammatical clause. When you can move a group of words, it's a phrase. All right, this test can also fail. It doesn't fail by giving false positives. When you can move something, it'll be a phrase. Don't worry about that. It sometimes gives false negatives, which is to say that there are different kinds of sentences you make by moving stuff. A pseudo cleft is not the only kind of movement test you can do. But no matter what kind of movement test you pick, there are always some phrases that won't move because of some characteristics of the sentence. There can be a variety of reasons. All right? So if we take this sentence, I can't think of a movement test that would move the noun phrase, those species. Those species is a noun phrase. We showed that with the substitution test. I can't think of a movement test that would work to show that. That doesn't mean that the substitution test was wrong. It means that the movement test sometimes gives false negatives. All right, for that one, the substitution test worked really well. Okay, now let's use the movement test to find the boundaries of a few more noun phrases. All right, look at each of the phrases I've moved here. You'll see that in each case, if you move either fewer words or more words, you get an ungrammatical clause. Yes, we can, because Jersey Shore is what they were not exposed to. Or you could do is not what they were exposed to. It's grammatical either way. Jersey Shore moves. On second thought, we see that the worst year ever is what this was, in fact. Stylistically bad, syntactically good. Now, how about this gray big long one? The BP oil spill which oozed up, blah, blah, blah. Big long one, but I can move it. The BP oil spill which oozed up from the depths and spread totally out of control like some kind of hideous, uncontrollable metaphor is what was the perfect symbol for the awfulness of 2010. It moves. All right, so the movement test can help you. And there's one more test that might be able to help you. This is called the standalone test. When you do this one, you imagine that the thing that you're thinking of as probably a noun phrase, the phrase that you're testing, the string of words that you're testing, you imagine that somebody has asked a question and that exact string of words is the answer to the question. People will tend to answer questions in complete phrases. All right, let's take the worst year ever in this sentence. So on second thought, we see that this was in fact the worst year ever. I've called the worst year ever a noun phrase by a couple other tests. All right, suppose somebody says to you, what year was that? Now, don't worry about semantically, but it sounds okay if you say the worst year ever. It does not sound okay to say worst year ever. That is not a complete noun phrase because it left off its determinative. The singular countable nouns in English want to have a determinative in their phrase. How about if somebody says, what year was that? And you say, the worst year. That one is sort of okay, right? But it's not as good as the worst year ever. It's probably sort of okay because if we left off ever in the sentence, it would sort of be okay too. It just wouldn't be as specific. This test, the standalone test, could even help us get the noun phrases in the title. If we look at the title, we see that the first part, Dave Beer's Year in Review, doesn't have a clause in it. So that can make some tests really hard to apply, right? The substitution test and the movement test kind of depend on having a clause, usually. All right, but the standalone test can sometimes save us in a case like this. We can imagine a question where Dave Beer's Year in Review is the answer. Not a goofy one like what's the title of the article, because that would be cheating. But how about what's that article about? Oh, Dave Beer's Year in Review. That sounds okay. Dave Beer's Year. That also sounds okay, because that could be a noun phrase. Although, if we analyze the actual part of the title, we're going to have to concede that in review, the prepositional phrase is modifying a head noun. What does not sound okay is year in review. Doesn't work. That is a singular countable noun, again, without its determinative. In the title here, Dave Beer's Year in Review, the genitive noun phrase Dave Barry is standing in as a determinative, taking the place of the determinative. So Dave Barry, and you can probably already figure this out because it's in genitive case, but it's not okay, you could argue that it's a noun phrase by itself, but its role inside the whole title phrase is dependent, modifying year, the head noun. If you want to say that Dave Barry is a noun phrase modifying the head noun, so it's a noun phrase inside a bigger noun phrase, that's okay. But you can't leave it out of the bigger noun phrase. You can't just say year in review. If you answer, you have to answer with a complete noun phrase. Okay. Now let's try analyzing the whole passage. I'll give you the whole passage, not the whole article, but the passage that we looked at before. I'm going to give you that back. Let's put every noun phrase in brackets. And before you start, let me say a couple things. First, when a noun gets to be part of an idiom, sometimes the grammatical structure inside the idiom stops working as well. The grammatical structure starts getting lost. More or less, the idiom starts becoming one big complex word. At that point, your test don't work. Sorry about that. But it doesn't happen too often, and I'll show you in this passage where it happens. This passage contains the phrase, for example. Okay, example is a noun. And for example is a prepositional phrase with for as the head, and example as a noun phrase that's dependent of the preposition in origin. All right? Now, because structure is lost with idioms, it may be functioning as something else. Don't worry about that. Just bracket example and call it a noun phrase, because a preposition needs to have a noun phrase. You're going to see the same thing with the phrase in perspective. Okay, perspective is a singular noun, countable noun. It should, in theory, have a determinative. It doesn't, because in perspective is an idiom. It's a prepositional phrase, and perspective is a noun phrase. Now, in this title, do you see one that does the same thing? Dave Berry's Year in Review. Yeah, review. It's the same way. In review has gotten to be an idiom. So just call review a noun phrase and don't worry about it. Here's another one that's pretty idiomatic. You're going to see the word let's. Now, I think I just ignored that when I underlined all of the nouns because of reasons that I think I don't want to explain. Because it's just become such an idiom that I doubt if we really understand it as the verb let plus the pronoun us. However, if you think that we do understand it that way and you want to call that a pronoun because it stands for us, that is fine. I am certainly not going to argue with that. Us is a pronoun in general, so call it a pronoun if you like. All right, so the first thing is don't worry about idioms. The second thing, remember that every noun that you find is either the head of a noun phrase or it's a dependent of a head noun. Thinking about what dependence a noun can have can help suggest the boundaries of the phrase, where it starts and where it ends, and which nouns are inside noun phrases. Okay, for example, in this title, we saw that the word review follows a preposition. We know that nouns do not have prepositions for dependence. They can have prepositional phrases. A head noun can have a prepositional phrase inside of it, but a noun does not have a preposition as a dependent. So if we have a phrase in review, we know that even though the tests don't work on the word review, it must be a noun phrase by itself, because what else could be there with it? We can identify review as a noun. In is certainly not a dependent, and there's nothing else there that could be a dependent. That's the end. So review is a noun phrase all by itself. So you can think about, okay, is it possible that the word beside it is a dependent or not? If it's a determinative, it's possible. If it's an adjective, it's definitely possible. If it's a preposition, no way. All right. But some nouns will be dependents of other nouns. Don't forget that part. Noun phrases and bare nouns can both be dependents of head nouns. Here, I'll give you one example, a couple examples. You can have a noun phrase that goes determinative, noun, and then head noun. The first noun's a dependent. Here's an example, a rubber ball. Ball is the head of the phrase. Rubber is a noun, but it's not the head of the phrase. It's a dependent. Now, I think you're arguing in your head with me that rubber is an adjective. I would argue that it's not, but here, take this one, a soccer ball. Soccer's not an adjective, right? Soccer's a noun. You play soccer. Can be a direct object of play, and it works exactly the same way. Okay, so sometimes a noun is inside a noun phrase, and case number 2, sometimes a noun phrase is inside a bigger noun phrase. So you can get a structure that goes like this. Determinative, and the determinatives are optional, right? You could get each of these structures leaving off the determinatives, but let's take one where it has one. Determinative, and then a noun phrase, and then the head noun. And then, let's make an even more complicated one. Suppose that after that, it has a prepositional phrase, which has a preposition, of course, as its head, and a noun phrase as its object. And then the whole thing makes a big noun phrase. So here's an example like that. An India rubber, that's a noun phrase because India modifies rubber. Ball is the head of the big phrase. Under the couch is a prepositional phrase. The couch is a noun phrase inside the prepositional phrase. So what do you have happening here? You have two noun phrases inside a bigger noun phrase. So allow for that possibility. Okay, here's your passage. Put brackets around every noun phrase that you see. Pause the video while you do this. And when you're ready, go on. Okay, here's my analysis. Compare it to yours. Questions that you have about where you can't figure out differences, post something on the discussion board. But if you've taken linguistics courses, you are liable to have put more brackets inside noun phrases than I did. So, for example, I bracketed the BP oil spill as just a big noun phrase, but it is valid to do something like oil spill, smaller noun phrase, BP oil spill, bigger noun phrase, the BP oil spill, bigger noun phrase. If you didn't do that, that's perfectly fine. I'm just saying that if you did that because you've already taken a linguistics course and you're used to parsing noun phrases at that level of detail, that's fine. If you have differences beyond that, it would be better that you ask me about them on the discussion board.